Welcome to the Path Less Traveled Gaming's Altered Destinies, where asking what if is kind of like foreplay. The longer you do it, the less real work you gotta do. I'm your host, Tieranen, and with me is my co-host, Jezzy.
Hello and welcome in, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, Tier.
Pleasure to have you, bud. If you are new to this show, what we do here is we propose and discuss a scenario that would alter the plot of a video game as we know it.
In doing so, we will discuss plot points of the main game, the scenarios that revolve around it, and possibly more games in the franchise related to it. That means everything we discuss will most likely be heavy with spoilers.
Every episode we do will contain a warning about what games could potentially be spoiled by our conversations. This episode's spoiler alert will cover the entirety of the Resident Evil franchise.
With all that being said, let's begin and ask what if.
Well, Jez, it's our first official episode. Are you ready for this?
I've been waiting to do this for a long time, man.
All right, let's get going on it. Today, I want to talk a little bit about Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 is a game that I grew up with in my teenage years that I absolutely loved, even though survival horror was never a genre that I was ever really interested in. I honestly didn't like the horror genre at all growing up. I got introduced to horror movies when I was like 5, and that just killed it for me. But Resident Evil 2 was something that kind of stuck with me, and I really enjoyed. What about you?
I had quite the opposite experience growing up, actually. I loved the survival horror genre when I was younger, mostly because my dad let me watch horror movies at a really young age. He told me many times about me laughing during the original It. So being introduced video games, the survival horror, it was fun with the old fixed camera angles and the tank controls. I miss those days, and I don't think we're going back there anytime soon with the genre.
I mean, we could talk about that all day and all night, about the glory days of how Resident Evil and Silent Hill and Dino Crisis series even, how they handled as games. But more importantly, what we're here to do is ask the most important question that this podcast is going to ask of every single scenario that we come across, as a matter of fact, not just video games, but it's going to be the question of what if? What if we took something and we made just a tiny little change, or we made a big sweeping dramatic change? What would we be able to accomplish and do to our favorite video games, our favorite franchises, or what about even taking something out of a video game and turning it into real life? And that's what we're going to do today, is we are going to take a piece of Resident Evil 2 and we're going to change it, and we're going to make a new scenario, an interesting scenario that I think we could have a lot of fun with.
Hopefully that just doesn't change too much.
I don't think it will, but I think it's going to create an interesting scenario down the line that I think we'd all still enjoy. So, you remember the character Sherry Birkin, don't you?
Ah! Wait! Let me go! Easy, easy there! I'm not a zombie! You're safe now. Leon, come in. I found the girl, and I've cleared the wreckage that was blocking the corridor.
Got it.
My name's Claire. What's yours?
Sherry.
The annoying little tag-along? Of course I do.
My first experience with the perpetual escort quest, I would say, would be Sherry Birkin, and not always the fun one to remember growing up and experiencing video games, but I've also ran across ones that were a lot worse for wear when it comes to escort quests in video games.
Ashley, Resident Evil 4.
That
Looking
was
at you.
the entire game, especially in the original one. She holds her own, or at least does a little bit better in the remake. But I digress. Sherry Birkin was a teenage girl, at least teenage or preteen, one of the two. It was in that genre, or in that area of age, about 12, 13-ish. The daughter of two scientists that were involved with Umbrella, who developed the G virus. Now, the G virus being the really big plot point in Resident Evil 2. It is what causes pretty much the most damage in the entire Raccoon City saga outside of the tyrants, I would say. I don't know, would you happen to agree with that, or...
I'm sorry, I was thinking about that for a little bit. I don't think the Tyrants really did too much. The Tyrants had specific targets.
Yep. Tyrants were more programmed to do damage to specific individuals, such as the Stars, or to hunt the members of the holdouts in the police station as well. But
So yeah, the normal G virus infection, I'd definitely say, was the larger damage there.
the G virus itself, I think, was the most important part of Resident Evil 2, because without the G virus, you're really only surviving on Tyrant as a main fixture, a main foil for the characters to come across and defeat. And in Resident Evil 2, for those of you who haven't played it and might not know, the multiple scenario system, especially for the 1998 version of the game, which is the one we're primarily going to be discussing today. However, we can also do the what if with the remake scenario as well. But in the 1998 edition of Resident Evil 2, the scenarios were a lot more different. There was a lot of ways you could see differences in the stories, how they played, how they felt. It was a very different game across both Claire and Leon's campaigns, but also their B scenarios as well.
Definitely a lot changed when you flipped the scenarios around. The gameplay, just the story changed so much. All the things that you were expecting to happen, since you would do Claire A, Leon B. If you did Leon A, Claire B, you're expecting these plot points, and they just never happened.
Exactly.
I was kind of disappointed.
Exactly, and the greatest part about that is part of what we're talking about there is going to be involved in the change going forward. But why don't we talk a little bit about who Sherry Birkin really is and what her importance is to the franchise as a whole. Sherry Birkin is the daughter of William and Annette Birkin, the two virologists who were taking part in T-virus research at Umbrella's secret facility in the Arklay laboratory. They also did the development of the G virus, which was a major thing that the Umbrella Corporation found out about and sent the Umbrella Security Service task force to obtain from the two doctors. However, during the raid, they ended up shooting and wounding William mortally for the most part, but in his last-ditch effort of him to not allow his research to be taken back by Umbrella, he injects himself with a sample of the G virus, causing him to mutate almost immediately and go after the members of the USS that were sent to obtain all samples of the G virus and retrieve them so they could be kept by Umbrella. So that happens before the lead-in events of Resident Evil 2. Sherry Birkin comes in about a quarter of the way through the game, in Claire's campaign, as being a ward of Chief Irons, somewhat. He's kind of been tasked with keeping her safe from any harm inside of the Raccoon City Police Department. And he's not really doing a good job keeping an eye on her or anything. She's just kind of running around, doing whatever she wants. And since she hasn't seen her parents and she doesn't know what's going on with her parents, she's kind of running around loose trying to find her parents, thinking that her mom and dad are going to show back up at the police station and, you know, come get her and take her to safety. Little does she know that her dad is now going to be on a rampage as a mutated bioweapon, and her mom
Specifically looking for her.
yes, specifically looking for her, and her mom really doesn't care too much about her. She's more worried about William, and it's very cold-hearted of Annette to react the way she does through the game. Literally at one point being more concerned about tracking William than whether Sherry is actually in a safe place or not. At a certain point, though, in the sewer system, William comes across Sherry, and he actually implants her in the 1998 version with an embryo of the G virus. Now, in the remake, this happens at the orphanage, but in the original, we don't actually get to see the orphanage, so we don't experience any of that. This all happens in the actual sewer system underneath Raccoon City, in between the Raccoon Police Department, and
The Nest Lab.
And the Nest Lab. So Sherry gets infected in the sewer. Claire finds her, recovers her, takes her up to the Nest Lab, and figures out a way to come across or synthesize a vaccine for this virus. She synthesizes the vaccine for this virus, and able to cure it. We live happily ever after, right?
Of course. No
Wrong.
story ends wrong.
See, that's where we're wrong. If you just left it at Resident Evil 2, then you would think that all's well that ends well. Even though you know that there are other games in the Resident Evil franchise. What
But she
happened?
doesn't appear again for 3 more games? She's out in 3, 4, or 5. She comes in all of a sudden at 6.
She does. However, if you play through the ending of Resident Evil 3, you'll come across some files that talk about what happened to all 3 of the characters that escaped Raccoon City from Resident Evil 2. Leon, Claire, and Sherry Birkin. So what do you think happened to Sherry after they escaped Raccoon City?
I always just assumed Claire and Leon adopted her when I was younger.
You know, that would be a great guess, but you are very far off. What happens is, all 3 of them are taken into protective custody. At some point during protective custody, Leon tells Claire to go find your brother. So Claire leaves to go find Chris, leaving Leon and Sherry in protective custody. Leon ends up joining the DSO, also known as the Division of Security Operations, which is pretty much led by the president, right? He does this to ensure Sherry's safety under protective custody. However, while she's in protective custody, she's having a lot of tests being ran on her because she was infected with a biological weapon, a virus, that was at one point causing her to mutate. But since the synthesis of the cure at the Nest facility, she stopped developing symptoms of the virus. However, during these tests, they find out that she has a regenerative property.
You want to tell me what the hell just happened?
Long story.
Yeah, maybe it's your blood they should be testing for vaccines.
They already did. More than I can stand.
So she's able to take punishment and take damage and regenerate from it faster than a normal human.
It sounds like she didn't get a cure. She just got something that stopped the virus from overtaking her, but gave her all the benefits of the progenitor virus.
And you see, this is a common story in the Resident Evil franchise. You can actually take this in Resident Evil 3 with Jill. Her cure for the Tyrant's version of the T-virus makes her immune to that virus. It doesn't give her, like, very special properties, but it actually gives her an immunity towards the T-virus, which is interesting that they would work in that the cure isn't really a cure. It's more of a, well, you just can't become more infected by what it is that you've been cured by. Anyways, getting back to the main purpose of this. During the testing of Sherry Birkin's biological samples, they come up with a new potent virus under the eventual antagonist of Resident Evil 6, Derek C. Simmons. This new virus that they can create from her biological data, called the C virus. And that's what leads to the massive, almost world-ending takeover in the Resident Evil 6 game, which takes place in December of, or not just December, but takes place across 2012-2013. So, we've led ourselves from Resident Evil 2 to Resident Evil 6 on the basis that the C virus is created from the blood or biological data of somebody who had been injected with the G virus. Why is that important? Because there was only one person that could ever have been infected by the G virus outside of William himself. And that's Sherry Birkin. Because the way the G virus worked was the person who took the embryo of the G virus had to have been a direct descendant of the person infected with the G virus. There was no other way around it. So if you take Sherry out of the equation, or she is no longer able to have been infected, you take the G virus and potentially other things out of the hand of scientists working on other biological weapons. So that's the what if for our first episode of the Path Less Traveled, Gaming's Altered Destiny. What if Sherry Birkin was never infected with the G virus?
Because we don't see that in Claire B, do we?
Exactly. See, this is where we're going with this. If you play the game the intended way, you start off with Claire A, Leon B in the 1998 version of Resident Evil 2. However, if by some chance you did what 99.9% of people did, because Leon disc was the first disc technically, even though they weren't numbered or labeled, other than Leon and Claire. Leon's disc was the primary disc in the front of the 2-disc case. So 99% of the people are going to go towards that as the first disc. Logic would say, hey, start with this one. It's the one on top, right?
Makes sense.
Exactly. So if you play it that way, all throughout the game, Sherry Birkin never comes in contact with William Birkin. They don't even come super close. However, in parts of Claire B, it is super funny. She'll disappear for a moment, and then you go through like 20 minutes, 30 minutes of the game, and then she just like runs through a door and is right there. Like, okay, cool. Super glad that you're safe, child, Where have you
Stop,
been?
stop doing that, please.
Like, where have you been? You are 13 years old. You do not have a gun. You do not have a way to protect yourself. And you run slow. You can't really be outrunning a lot of this stuff around here, especially like the Cerberuses, because those are super fast. And I know if you came across the liquor, you'd be toast.
Yeah, but there are worse things out there for her, like the police chief.
Exactly, like she finds. So, that's the easiest way that we could come up with a plot change for how Sherry would never have been infected with the G virus. You just play the game the way that it was not intended to be played. Leon A, Claire B. In that mode, she never comes in contact with William. She never gets infected by the G virus and goes on from there. So what's going to happen after the point? I would actually say that not much is going to change. She would still go into protective custody with Leon and Claire. Claire would still go off and do her Code Veronica thing with Chris. Leon would join the DSO because he proved valuable as a asset in the Raccoon City incident, so he would still have his Resident Evil 4. But now, what are we going to do with Sherry? What would you do with Sherry?
She would probably just try to follow on in her parents' footsteps, or try to prevent anything like that from ever happening again. So there's two different paths. She could try to make her own progenitor virus strain, or she could try to stamp out anybody trying to do so. However, I don't think she would have the resources to stop people from doing that, because Umbrella, that it eventually becomes Tricell, right? I don't think she could stop it. Even with the government's help.
I don't think she could, even with the government's help either. However, I would think that the government would take a look at this little girl who is the daughter of two brilliant scientists and doctors from Umbrella, and might want to invest a little bit of energy in seeing what she's capable of. She probably has a knack for science, because she was in the Arklay laboratory with her parents. So she's been around the facilities and probably knows a little bit about everything. If they invest some time and energy in getting her the help she needs, she probably could go on to become a virologist herself. One of the things I would love to see is, we know that Rebecca Chambers, especially in the Resident Evil movies, she becomes a virologist herself and starts working with the organizations that go against the Umbrella Corporation and against Tricell to try to find cures. As a matter of fact, Rebecca Chambers, I think, is on file in the movies as curing 2 or 3 different strains of like the T virus. So there's a potential that she could follow in her parents' footsteps as a virologist. However, she would be doing it to combat against those who are trying to create bioweapons and be involved in bioterrorism. She would be on the synthesis of cures, probably even working with Rebecca Chambers to some great effect and finding success in the ability of being able to help rather than hurt. Granted, she wouldn't have any kind of field experience like she ends up getting by signing up with the DSO in the original timeline. So she wouldn't be on the front lines. She would be in the tents, working behind the scenes in the laboratories, maybe calling in and talking to and advising maybe Leon and Claire, Chris, Jill, because even Rebecca worked with all of the other organizations that every other character in the franchise has worked for. BSA, DSO, the one that Claire works for, I always mess their name up.
I think you mean TerraSave.
Yes, that's the one. I always get their name wrong. With this change, one significant thing that happens is we no longer see Sherry in Resident Evil 6. And Sherry does play a fairly important role in that as a foil for one Jake Mueller. Now, who's Jake Mueller, Jezzy?
Jake Mueller, we find out very later in the game, is actually Albert Wesker's son.
That's the rendezvous.
About damn time. You know, those shots of yours pack one hell of a punch, lady.
So, you're Wesker Jr.
Wesker? He lost me.
Albert Wesker was a colossal imbecile. A fool who tried to destroy the world. He was also your father.
What?
Which makes you heir to a very special blood type.
And why is that important? Because Jake Mueller is infected with blood that could potentially be used to cure viruses that are currently out there being used for biological purposes, biological warfare purposes.
That does sound very important.
That is very important. Now, if we're to take Sherry out of the equation here, who's going to step into that role? Who's going to fill that position?
I think we could shift characters over a little bit. Maybe throw Piers over there? Bring in Jill or Claire?
I think I got one scenario that's going to really kind of rock your socks here. So one thing that I think would be a really great change here, in place of Sherry being the foil for Jake Mueller in Resident Evil 6, what if Jill Valentine took less time to recover from what she went through in Resident Evil 5, which, for those of you who are unaware, didn't play Resident Evil 5, she was actually kind of taken over, controlled by Albert Wesker using a implanted, it looked like a brooch, but it implanted thoughts for her to do whatever Wesker wanted her to do, and gave her an alternate personality that clashed with Chris and made her more of a bad guy than the good guy that she's always been. One would think after going through a traumatic event like that and her being possessed like that by Wesker for as long as she was, might take a little time off from work and recover, get her brain back in order. Nah, ever the consummate professional, Jill Valentine hops right back into duty with the BSAA. And the DSO tells the BSAA about somebody that is important to biological research that they need to get their hands on, but it needs to be done hush-hush. So they send Jill out to find Chris, who's in a drunken stupor, can't remember what's going on. He's been down for a while with some PTSD issues involving losing a unit recently. So she finds him. She brings him back into the fold, takes good care of him, gets him back on his feet, and sends him out to rendezvous and bring in Jake Mueller. He doesn't know why. He just knows that this is a HVT, high-value target, that needs to be brought into command, and it needs to be done very soon, so that way they can do with him whatever they need to do. As far as Chris is concerned, it's just he needs to be protected because he is just the son of a senator, son of vice president, of somebody.
Chris just follows orders. He doesn't need reasons why.
Exactly. And then we come to that point in the facility towards the end of Resident Evil 6 where Chris finds out for the first time who he's been protecting.
I can see your father in you.
How did you know?
Wait, hold on a second. So you knew him? Yeah, I did. But I'm the one that killed him. You? That's right.
Chris?
Better put a leash on that puppy. This is between me and him. Go ahead. Shoot. You have every right to.
Tell me. We just following orders? Or was it personal?
Both.
Jake, please stop.
Put a bullet
Just
in your
put
head!
your gun down.
Drop your
Don't
weapon!
do this!
There are more important things at stake than you and me.
Now, Jill's known. And she wasn't very happy about it. But she knew what needed to be done. Because she knew this was going to be the only way to make the world right again. Was this guy's blood was going to be needed to help synthesize an antivirus to the C virus. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, how do we still have the C virus? And that's a good question. The way we still have the C virus is you could still take Wesker's blood in Resident Evil 5 or even before that and create something similar to the C virus with time and a little bit more attention to detail. There's still a way to get a virus out there. It doesn't even have to be the C virus. It could be any sort of virus that you could come up with.
They could just remake the T virus. All the research data was still there.
Exactly. But the blood of Jake Mueller could still be used as the key to cure those afflicted with whatever virus we're calling it nowadays, which is just kind of easier to go with, still calling it the C virus, of course. Just think, on that moment, going back to that facility where we find out, as Chris is finding out, that Jake Mueller is the son of Wesker. The person who started all of this, essentially. This has been the main person that Chris has stood up against since Resident Evil 1. He's had fights with him in Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil Code Veronica, Resident Evil 5. He finally gets the best of him. So he thinks. And now, he's got to protect his son. The son of the man who's taken away so much of this guy's life. Friends, colleagues, co-workers, family members. He's lost a lot to this guy's father, but yet this guy, Jake, is the most important thing in the world, has to be recovered safely. I think any good writer could take a plot point like that and hammer home the level and intensity of emotions that somebody who's done everything in their power to protect against one man's greedy want for destruction, and then you put him in the face of this guy's son and tell him, hey, this is who he is, this is who he's related to. And Jake in the entirety of the game is no like really awesome person. He's a very gruff individual, hard to like. He acts very similar to his father. The entire time he's making jokes about wanting to be paid $1 million for the one sample of his blood that they need to make this all better.
Small price to pay.
Small price to pay, of course.
But yeah, he was definitely an unlikable character. My one and only playthrough of 6, I was actually Jake, and it was just so hard to connect with the character because he was making all the jokes that I would make in these situations. I don't like that.
Kind of hard to have a mirror shown at yourself, huh?
It is.
But yeah, getting back to it, this would be a really heartbreaking moment. And I think that this would put a really, really massive strain on Chris's relationship with Jill. Knowing that Jill knew this and was withholding this, I mean, yeah, they'd probably be under the same circumstances where, okay, do whatever it takes to get the job done, even if that means, you know, leading astray somebody that you're working with. He would understand it in the long run, but I don't think he'd ever really fully recover from it. I think there'd still be some animosity between the two of them in the long run. Just because, like, you would think after how many years of them working together, how many missions they'd been on together, the times that they'd spent, and everything that they knew about one another, you would think that she might feel more comfortable telling him the truth, and that it would be important for him to know why he was doing what he was doing, instead of just giving him a, hey, it needs to be done. It's our duty, it's our job. It's what we took the oath for and joined the BSAA for.
That would have been a huge betrayal moment for Chris, definitely. He still would probably be fine with Jill, but a little more hesitant and a little more inquisitive of why she would give him missions, or she would try to advise him.
And looking at Chris's character moving forward from Resident Evil 6, going into, you know, the tail end of Resident Evil 7 and the end of Resident Evil Village, or in the middle parts of Village, the beginning part, middle part, and the end part, looking at how he acts and reacts to things, you could really say, like, hey, this character looks and feels and sounds troubled. And then you could point back to this plot point and be like, well, there's a very massive betrayal that he went through at the hands of one of his colleagues, the company that he works for, and he's probably just not over it. Of course, you know, he also has the PTSD from losing his unit prior to the events that happened in 6. But still, everything all said and done, and the new rewritten version of Resident Evil 6, you come across somebody who's got a lot more emotion involved in it, because not only is it a friend, but it's a friend and a colleague. Or not only is it a colleague, but it's a friend and a colleague.
It's a close friend that you've done so much with, went through so much with.
Because,
so the betrayal would be bad.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's Piers who breaks the news, it's either Piers or it's Sherry, that Jake is the son of Albert Wesker. But I know it's got to be one of those two. It's either Piers or it's Sherry. And if it's Sherry, then having Jill break it makes sense. If it was Piers, I still think switching it over to Jill would make sense. And it would make for like I said, an even more emotional moment. But if it was Sherry in the long run, then I could see it being a different outcome than it should have been in the main game.
Sherry would want to protect him at all costs because she wants to, you know, get his blood to be able to inoculate the world, to stop spread this disease, this virus.
Exactly. Sherry was more on the side of Jake than she was on the side of the BSAA. She didn't care about the BSAA. If they would have never ran into one another, she would have been fine. Even in the second or third level where they run into Chris and Piers and they're fighting the big guy in the middle of the town while they're going through and fighting the army as well of the infected people. Even though, I mean, that's where their paths crossed the first time around. She wasn't keen to give out any kind of information, and it wasn't because of who they ran into. It was just because she wanted in and out. They had a mission. They were trying to get from point A to point B, and it just took them through point A, point 5, going through and meeting up with Chris and Piers was kind of just a thing that happened. It wasn't something that necessarily would have been planned by the DSO or the BSAA.
It was just unfortunate paths cross and hell on earth, basically.
Yeah. So that's what I have for the change. and what I think would happen in the instance of if Sherry was never infected with the G virus. We would see essentially a pretty decent size of the story change. Her character as a whole would change from being the survivor who comes into her own as a force to be reckoned with, as a agent herself who's looking to help other people with the problems that they're going through, and eventually a trusted agent that goes out and hunts down the person with the blood similar to hers that can, help come up with a cure for what's going on in the world. We could see her change into a similar person whose own agency is reduced. I don't want to say reduced. Reduced is a bad term. It would be changed from being an active agent to being more of a passive scientist. But that's where a lot of the hard work and stuff would be done, is in the labs, finding out what they could do to come up with cures and antiviruses and everything like that. I think she would do a lot of great work. And it would be really cool to see somebody working with Rebecca Chambers. We don't get to see a lot of Rebecca Chambers. And I don't want this to be the Rebecca Chambers show, because we are talking about Sherry Birkin here. But it would be cool if we could give her somebody that she could work with that, she would have something in common with. Instead of, even in the movies, even though she's taken out of the field for the most part, and even subsequently put back into the field, Rebecca doesn't really connect as well with the other characters based on what she does now as, say, she would if she were to connect with a scientist version of Sherry Birkin. Because then she'd be talking to, the daughter of two of the most major or important scientists that worked for Umbrella, the people who invented the G virus. She'd be talking to her, and she'd be sharing experiences with what happened between, with her and Umbrella, and, being able to confide in her based on what she came across with her experience in the first Resident Evil.
Being able to share that with somebody like Sherry would be massive, because Sherry went through a lot of the same things, and she has this great upbringing that would make her a very good virologist, because I'm pretty sure she would have seen a lot of things they did in the lab, because Sherry was in the Nest lab, a few times while they were working. And I'm pretty sure she had seen notes or saved some of the notes that her parents had on the G virus, and being able to share that with somebody like Rebecca, it would help out the entire world, and it would make a really good dynamic, I think.
I agree, 100%. So part of what we're also doing, not just talking about, what's going to change is the plot, what's going to change in the later storylines and everything like that. What would this change do to the franchise as a whole, outside of the game, in real life? Would there be changes? Would things just feel different? Would the franchise still be as prosperous as it was in an alternate version of life where Sherry Birkin was never infected with the G virus, and that's the plot points that they wanted to go with? And I gotta say, I don't think that changing this plot point really has any effect on the franchise as a whole. I believe that one thing that this does is, if they went this route with it, they probably could have gotten away with the storylines being a little bit differently implemented, rather than it being like a Leon A, Claire B, or, vice versa. They probably could have done a more extended version of the Leon A campaign and a more extended version of the Claire B campaign, to where there's no alternate universe type of scenario, but we get a little bit more plot points, a little bit more gameplay and stuff like that. Or I guess they could have done it just the same, and we in an alternate universe could be talking about hey, what happened if she did get infected with the G virus, like in Claire A, Leon B.
Yeah, I really don't think there would be too many changes in real life that would happen because of this. One thing I would like to point out is maybe Resident Evil 6 would have gotten some better sales because it had, Jill and Chris in this alternate reality that we have discussed. But that's neither here nor there.
See, I'd tell you what, if they would have done that, if it would have been Jill in there with Chris, the only other thing that they could have done that would have made it a much better selling game is if they would have figured out a way to shoehorn Claire in there. However, before we talk anything about that topic, we're actually going to save that one and put a pin in it, because that might be a topic for a future episode of the Path Less Traveled Gaming's Altered Destinies. Well, before we call it, is there anything else you'd like to add, Jez?
I'd just like to say this has been an interesting thought project of what if. I know this is only our first one, but I can't wait to record more.
Same. I'm very interested on what we can do with this. It's going to be a fun ride. But before we call it any further, I do want to say thank you to everyone for joining the podcast, whether it's been on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from. If you have an idea for an episode of the podcast or want to join the community, we'll leave a link in the episode description to our Discord where you can follow us, talk to the community, and post ideas for future topics.
If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're listening wherever you get your podcast from, make sure to rate, review, and follow.
For Jezzy, I'm Tieranen of the Path Less Traveled Gaming's Altered Destiny podcast, reminding you that only when you start asking what if, can you truly take the path less traveled.